It is the early hours of April 30th, 1943, roughly 1 mile off the coast of Huelva in southern Spain. A British submarine called HMS Seraph sits low in the dark water, her crew on deck in dressing gowns, ordered there so that no one can later swear under oath that they witnessed what is about to happen. Captain Bill Jewell reads a burial service aloud, the words chosen with care so that any U-boat hydrophone operator or curious fisherman might later report nothing stranger than a funeral at sea. Then 4 men lift a steel canister, 18 feet long and built to look, if anyone should ask, like a meteorological container, and tip it gently into the Atlantic swell. Inside is the body of a man dressed as a Royal Marines officer. Strapped to his wrist by a chain is a black leather briefcase. In his pockets are theater ticket stubs, a snapshot of a fiancée, a stern letter about an unpaid overdraft, and 2 letters from senior British generals, one addressed to General Sir Harold Alexander in North Africa, discussing the next great Allied assault on Hitler's Europe. None of it is true. The officer never existed. The letters were forged. The fiancée's photograph belongs to a secretary in London who has no idea her face is about to travel to Spain inside a dead man's coat pocket. Even the body itself has been borrowed, without its owner's consent, from a London mortuary, because the man who once lived inside it cannot give consent. He has been dead for several weeks. What floats towards the Spanish shore that morning is not a corpse so much as a message, addressed not to the family of the deceased but to Adolf Hitler himself, and carried not by an agent who might be captured and tortured into confession, but by a man who can feel nothing, fear nothing, and betray nothing. He is, in the language the operations planners would later choose for him, the man who never was. And by the time the sun rises over Huelva harbor, the most audacious deception of the Second World War has already begun to drift towards its target, carried by nothing more sophisticated than the tide. This single body, dropped into the sea by 4 tired men on a submarine deck, would help conceal the location of an Allied invasion involving hundreds of thousands of troops would reach the desk of Adolf Hitler within a fortnight, and would, according to the post-war judgment of British intelligence historians, become perhaps the most successful deception of the entire war. Why a dead vagrant from a London coroner's slab came to carry the fate of an invasion is a story that says as much about the limits of bombs and tanks as it does about the strange power of a well-told lie. By the start of 1943, the Allies had a problem that no amount of firepower could solve. North Africa was nearly won. The Africa Corps was being squeezed out of Tunisia, and Allied planners were already looking at the map for the next move. Sicily sat there almost embarrassingly obviously, a stepping stone barely 100 miles from Tunisia's coast, the gateway to mainland Italy and the soft underbelly of Hitler's Europe that Churchill had long wanted to attack. Winston Churchill himself reportedly remarked that anybody but a damned fool would know it had to be Sicily. That, precisely, was the difficulty. If the obvious choice was obvious to British planners, it would be equally obvious to German ones. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring and the German High Command did not need brilliant intelligence work to guess Sicily. They needed only a map and common sense. By the spring of 1943, German divisions were already being reinforced on the island, with coastal defenses strengthened and reserves positioned within reach. Every Allied soldier who waded ashore in an unprepared landing where the enemy expected him would face a vastly higher chance of death. Military planners calculated that a defended anticipated invasion of Sicily could cost tens of thousands of Allied casualties in the opening days alone, a price that the Allies, still rebuilding their strength after years of attritional fighting, could not easily absorb. The existing tools of deception were primitive and unreliable. Double agents could feed false information to the Germans, but the Abwehr, German military intelligence, was not naive, and a single inconsistency could collapse an entire network built over years. Radio deception, fake troop concentrations, dummy tanks made of plywood and canvas, These had their uses but rarely survived close scrutiny by a determined enemy with reconnaissance aircraft and agents of his own. What the Allies needed was not another rumor fed through an unreliable asset. They needed proof. They needed Hitler's generals to hold something in their own hands that felt, looked, and read like an accidental glimpse into Allied strategy, something so convincing that no rational intelligence officer could dismiss it as a plant. The challenge was almost philosophically difficult. How does one convince a deeply suspicious enemy of a lie not by saying it, but by allowing him to discover it for himself, in circumstances so plausible that the very act of discovery becomes the proof of authenticity? It was, on the face of it, close to impossible. And it had in fact already been considered and rejected once before, deemed too far-fetched even for wartime intelligence. The man who would prove that judgment wrong, and the team he assembled, were about to attempt precisely that. The scheme had its origins in an extraordinary document drawn up years earlier within the Naval Intelligence Division at the Admiralty in London, a memorandum listing dozens of possible deception ideas, most fanciful, most never used. One entry, item 28 on that list, proposed planting a corpse with false papers where it would be found by the enemy. It had been inspired partly by a 1937 thriller in which a drowned airman's body, with secret documents in his pocket, washes ashore in neutral territory. The author of that memo's section, Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, who would go on after the war to invent a rather more famous secret agent, had recognized the cinematic appeal of the idea but never expected anyone to attempt it for real. That task fell in 1942 and into 1943 to two officers working within Room 13 of the Admiralty as part of an unassuming-sounding body called the 20 Committee, the name a play on the Roman numerals XX for double cross. Charles Cholmondeley, an RAF flight lieutenant on secondment to MI5 with a taste for the eccentric, and Ewan Montague, a barrister-turned-naval intelligence officer with a sharper, more skeptical mind, took the old corpse-on-the-beach idea and began, with almost obsessive attention to detail, to make it real. Their first and most delicate problem was acquiring a body that could plausibly be mistaken for a Royal Marines officer who had died after an aircraft went down at sea, ideally from drowning rather than any more obvious cause. Working with the renowned pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury, they settled on the corpse of Glyndwr Michael, a 34-year-old Welshman who had died on January 24, 1943 in a London warehouse after ingesting rat poison containing phosphorus, almost certainly without family connections likely to come asking questions. Spilsbury judged that the early stages of decomposition and the lingering effects of the poison could be made to resemble the symptoms of a man who had drowned after several days adrift, provided the body was moved and examined quickly, before any Spanish pathologist might notice the discrepancy. The body could not be frozen, since visible ice crystals or signs of thawing would betray the deception to a trained eye, so Cholmondeley and Montague worked against a ticking clock measured not in months, but in weeks, racing to construct an entire fictional human being before decomposition made the corpse useless. They invented Captain, Acting Major, William Martin of the Royal Marines, and built him a life from the ground up. A fiancée named Pam, complete with a photograph and 2 love letters laced with private, slightly risque jokes designed to read as authentic, a stern note from his bank manager about an overdraft, because real officers, the planners reasoned, have money troubles. A receipt for an engagement ring from a Bond Street jeweler, theater stubs from a London show, even a slightly grubby, well-used identity card because a brand new one would look suspicious. Every object was chosen to suggest a real, slightly careless human being, not a piece of carefully staged evidence, the same principle a forger uses when deliberately aging a banknote. The canister, built to carry the body south aboard the submarine HMS Seraph, was constructed at the Royal Naval Torpedo Establishment, designed to maintain a low temperature using dry ice and to be airtight enough to mask the smell of decomposition from the crew, roughly the dimensions of a large iron lung, weighing several hundred pounds when sealed. Only the submarine's captain was told what it truly contained. Officially, the crew were informed it was a top-secret meteorological device that had to be released in a specific location for reasons above their security clearance, a cover story so mundane that nobody thought to question it. The most delicate forgery of all was the letter itself, a private communication purportedly from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Alexander, casually mentioning, in the gossipy, slightly indiscreet style of two old colleagues, that the forthcoming Allied assault, codenamed in the letter for an invasion of Greece and Sardinia, would use Sicily merely as cover for a deceptive landing exercise, a line designed to make Hitler believe the obvious target was in fact the fake one. The letter's tone had to be perfect, official enough to be credible, informal enough to feel like a genuine slip of military gossip rather than a deliberately planted clue, and Nye himself helped draft the wording to ensure no genuine officer would write it any other way. By the last week of April 1943, Operation Mincemeat, as the scheme had been christened, with characteristically dark service humor about the fate of the body involved, was ready. HMS Seraph slipped out of Holy Loch in Scotland on April 19th, carrying its silent passenger 11 days south to the Spanish coast. If you're finding this as fascinating as I do, a quick subscribe genuinely helps more than you'd think and costs nothing at all. The body was released into the water in the early hours of April 30th, close enough to Huelva that the prevailing current would carry it to shore within hours. Spain, in 1943, was officially neutral, but riddled with German agents and sympathetic officials, precisely the environment the operation depended upon. A local fisherman discovered the body later that morning, and Spanish authorities, with the Abwehr's local station watching closely, took possession of the briefcase along with the corpse. What followed has only been partially reconstructed from surviving German and British records. The documents were examined by Spanish naval authorities, then, crucially, passed to German intelligence officers operating in Spain before being returned, with what British forensic analysis would later determine was telltale evidence of careful refolding, suggesting the letters had been removed from their envelopes, photographed or copied, and replaced. Adolf Klaus, a German agent operating undercover in Huelva, is understood to have played a central role in ensuring the contents reached Berlin. By May 14th, intelligence reports indicate that German High Command had not only seen the documents but had acted upon them, treating the supposed plans for Greece and Sardinia as a major and credible intelligence coup. The psychological effect on German planning appears to have been significant. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was dispatched towards Greece to oversee defensive preparations there, and additional minefields were laid off the Greek coast, all in the weeks immediately preceding the actual Sicily landings. Precise troop movement figures remain difficult to verify given the gaps in surviving German records, and some historians caution that German redeployment decisions were influenced by several converging factors rather than mincemeat alone. But the documentary evidence of Hitler's personal conviction that Greece was the target, sustained even after the Sicily landings had actually begun, is considered some of the clearest proof of the operation's effect. By contrast, German deception efforts in the same period rarely matched this level of staged improvisation. The Abwehr relied heavily on a network of double agents in Britain, most of whom, unknown to German intelligence, had in fact been captured and turned by the British themselves, meaning German deception was frequently being fed back through compromised channels rather than functioning independently. Where the Germans did attempt elaborate ruses, such as exaggerated radio traffic intended to suggest troop concentrations, these tended to lack the same forensic attention to human detail, the love letters, the overdraft notice, the worn identity card, that made mincemeat so persuasive. American deception efforts in the same theater, meanwhile, tended towards more conventional methods: dummy landing craft, fake radio chatter, diversionary raids. The United States had nothing comparable in scale or audacity to a fabricated human being complete with an invented love life. And indeed, American planners initially regarded the British scheme, when briefed on it, with a mixture of admiration and disbelief that anyone would risk an entire invasion's secrecy on something so theatrical. The closest later parallel, Operation Fortitude before the Normandy landings in 1944, used similar deception principles, including double agents and dummy armies, but drew direct inspiration from the lessons Mincemeat had demonstrated about feeding an enemy a story he wants to believe, rather than one he is merely told. The actual material impact of Operation Mincemeat on the Sicily campaign remains genuinely difficult to quantify, and honest historians resist overstating it. German divisions were still present on Sicily when the Allies landed on July 9, 1943, and fighting was far from bloodless. What the operation appears to have achieved was not the removal of defenses from Sicily, but the prevention of further reinforcement that might otherwise have arrived, along with the redirection of high-value units, including parts of a panzer division, towards Greece in the weeks before the landings. Allied casualties during the Sicily campaign, while still substantial, were lower than planners had originally feared, and the campaign concluded in roughly 38 days, considerably faster than the 90 days some assessments had projected. The deeper legacy of Mincemeat lies less in the body count it may have spared than in what it taught intelligence services about the architecture of believable deception. It demonstrated that the most convincing lie is rarely the one stated outright, but the one the enemy is allowed to discover and verify for himself, stitched together from mundane, human, slightly embarrassing details rather than grand declarations. That principle shaped Allied deception planning for the rest of the war and influenced intelligence doctrine for decades afterwards. The true identity of the man inside Major Martin's uniform remained a closely guarded secret for decades. Ewan Montague's own 1953 memoir of the operation, later adapted into a 1956 film, deliberately obscured who the body had really been, and it was not until 1996 that an amateur historian, working through declassified files, identified him conclusively as Glinder Michael. In 1998, his name was finally added to the gravestone in Huelva's San Marcos Cemetery, beneath the original inscription to William Martin, acknowledging at last that the Royal Marines officer buried there with full military honors had never actually held a naval commission of any kind. That headstone can still be visited today, a strange monument to a life that ended in obscurity and a death that helped shape the course of the war. Glyndwr Michael never wore a uniform in life. He left no military record, earned no commission, fired no shot in anger, and by most accounts died alone and largely unmourned in a London warehouse, the apparent victim of rat poison, whose presence in his body was never conclusively explained as either accident or design. And yet in death, dressed in a uniform he had no right to and given a name and a fiancée and an overdraft that belonged to no one, he became one of the most consequential British operatives of the Second World War, without ever volunteering, without ever knowing, without a single conscious moment of the war he helped to win. There were no medals for Glinder Michael, no citation, no acknowledgement at all for over half a century. The men who built his false identity, Cholmondeley and Montague, returned to civilian life and largely faded from public memory, their names known mainly to historians and to those who have read Montague's own carefully edited account or the more complete histories written after the relevant files were declassified. The submarine that carried him, HMS Seraph, went on to other secret missions before her eventual fate as a target vessel, sunk in weapons trials, the same quiet, unglamorous end that meets so much of the machinery of secret war. What Operation Mincemeat proves, in the end, is not that deception alone wins wars. It does not. Soldiers still had to wade ashore on Sicilian beaches under real fire, still had to take real ground at real cost. What it proves is that the most dangerous weapon in any nation's arsenal during the Second World War was not always made of steel or gunpowder. Sometimes it was paper. Sometimes it was a forged love letter, a worn identity card, a fictitious overdraft, and a man who could no longer object to being used. The body that floated towards Huelva on the morning of April 30th, 1943, carried no explosive, fired no shot, and yet it helped move armies, redirect a field marshal, and conceal an invasion from the most ruthless intelligence apparatus in Europe. He was buried under a name that was not his own, mourned by people who never knew him, and remembered for decades only as a fiction. The man who never was had, in the end, done something that very few men who ever lived can claim to have done. He helped end a war he never fought in, and saved lives he never knew existed, by doing nothing at all except lying still and letting the truth about him remain, for as long as it possibly could, entirely unknown.